Hello and welcome again to another episode of the Future of Funding podcast. Today's guest is Theresa Williamson, founder of Catalytic Communities in Brazil. Welcome, Theresa. I'm really excited to have this conversation today. Tell us a little bit about yourself, about Catalytic Communities, and anything exciting that's coming up in the near future.
Thank you so much, Rizwan, for inviting me to share some perspectives on the future of funding. It's an honor to be included in this project. This is a topic that I've been thinking about since starting Catalytic Communities 25 years ago. It's great to have an opportunity to share some ideas. So Catalytic Communities, we are a nonprofit that has existed since 2000 in the United States and Brazil. We have two statuses. We do our work in Brazil, specifically in the city of Rio, in the favelas of Rio. But I did create the organization in the US as well because of partnerships we have with universities and other allies internationally. And our goal is to support the full development of Rio's favelas on their terms. So these are informal settlements in Brazil. These are some of the most stigmatized urban communities in the world. They're probably the most famous, alongside a few in Mumbai and in Nairobi. So we are supporting grassroots groups in the favelas. Essentially, what we do as an organization is we identify community leaders who do good work and are trying to change these communities from the inside. And we develop ways to support them strategically in ways that are trying to create systemic change. We're not an organization focused on basic needs, though those are critical. Many of our community partners are, so we're supporting them in that. But ultimately, Catalytic Communities is trying to transform the way informal settlements are seen and ultimately developed and treated. And we do that in Rio, but with this idea that we are sharing what we're doing globally. Informal settlements are nearly a third of where people live in cities around the world. They're where population is growing the most. In terms of what we're doing coming up, we do work on narrative. So we have a favela reporting site that's bilingual called Rio on Watch. It's been around for 15 years. And today it's mostly reported by favela journalists and communicators. And it's very strategic because of the English. We're able to influence local policy in ways that some of the other community reporting sites can't. And at the same time, we developed the Sustainable Favela Network, which is a network of grassroots groups working to develop everything from community gardens, green roofs, agroforestry projects, to solar energy, environmental education initiatives, community-based sewage solutions. So it's essentially communities developing from the inside in the lack of public resources. They don't have full access to public services, et cetera. And so our organization is essentially supporting grassroots groups. I mentioned Rio on Watch through narrative. I mentioned the Sustainable Favela Network through development, but also the Community Land Trust Project, which is about providing land rights to these communities in ways that allow favelas to regularize legally with collective title for the land and individual title to the homes to avoid both eviction and gentrification. Anyway, that's what we do. And coming up, a lot of exciting things. We hope we'll have the first actual community land trust in Brazil after 8 years of solid effort passing laws, working with pilot communities and so on. Sustainable Favela Network is going to hold its second Sustainable Favela Festival in October with about 1,000 to 1,500 people. It's going to be a few weeks before the COP conference in Brazil. So we're going to be focused on trying to bring visibility to informal settlements within COP, the importance of addressing these communities, given that they are probably where the most concentrated risk is in the world in terms of the quantity of people in the world that will be vulnerable to climate change. So that's what we have coming up.
Wow. So the 25 years now, it's a long run since Catalytic Communities began. That gives you a very long history of exposure to funders of all kinds, I'm sure, from individuals, small and large, to CSR and foundations. And I think this would be a great place for us to begin, especially working with communities. What have you found to be your top 5 most helpful, game-changing funding practices that you've encountered?
So when you start an organization, I was 25 years old. Nobody knew who I was. I had a very experimental approach. I was doing a PhD in urban planning, and I had the opportunity to start the nonprofit as my doctoral dissertation project. So I come from the perspective of someone starting something from scratch and not knowing this world, to someone who's now 2 decades later gone through a number of different approaches. And because it was a dissertation project, I was able to look at fundraising in an experimental fashion in the beginning. So I guess if I had to list them, first, I think once an organization is established and has a track record, then it needs to be seen in a very different light. Rather than spending a lot of its time reconvincing new funders, there should be more respect for that track record and giving organizations more trust and more support so they can efficiently get on with the work. I actually developed an individual fundraising strategy after a couple of years of attempting foundations early on because of the flexibility it provided. Both challenges and opportunities come up regularly with our community partners and with the political context as we're trying this systemic change. And it's very hard to respond to those when you have a grant that tells you you have to agree to exactly what you're going to do way in advance. Doesn't give you the flexibility to respond to those opportunities and those challenges. And also, it can limit trust because if you can't respond to opportunities and challenges when you're working with vulnerable communities, then you might be shooting at the wrong goal in the moment. There might be something that's actually much more important in that moment for the community partner.
Yeah, just before you carry on, I want to pick up on that very important point that I think funders don't always recognize, which is that it's not just about trust between the nonprofit and the funder, but for impact to actually function, there has to be solid trust between the nonprofit and the community. And funding plays a critical role in the maintenance of that trust. You break the funding, you break that trust. And I think a lot of funders don't realize that.
Absolutely. We've developed an understanding within Catalytic Communities that trust with our community partners is core to everything we do. We can't do anything without that. The money is useless without that. We're there for the long haul. And I would say at this point, we have massive networks of trust. And that could only happen if you front and center those relationships over the relationships with funders. There's no question.
So the funders got to be able to respect that, right?
We've had to stay relatively low budget over the years because of that. There were moments where we had opportunities to become a fellow with such and such an institution, and it'll give us some support and visibility, but only if we expand to other cities, for example. And I said, well, our work is understanding the communities we're working with. Informal settlements are more complex than formal communities by nature because they're all individually designed based on the local resources, needs, the people there. There aren't outside blueprints. So every single informal settlement is unique. And if you're working with those communities, you need to be able to understand somewhat how they work, some of that complexity. And the leaders are the ones who know the complexity. The complexity actually also breeds some resilience, new approaches to development. It creates innovation in some cases. So sort of untangling all of that has been part of what CatCom is about. So back to your question, what's involved in supporting these organizations? I would say some of the things that have worked best for us is when funding is longer than a year. The longer, the better, especially if there's a guarantee of a few cycles, assuming the work is expanding and effective. So a grant of 2 years that allows for 3 cycles, so you kind of can reasonably expect 6 years, is incredibly empowering if it's done right. The problem is then if it's bound up in bureaucracy and reporting, and so you have to tell them exactly what you're doing, and then you have to apply the money exactly as you intended, and then opportunities come along. If we didn't have our individual funding base as a backbone for the organization, when the pandemic hit, we had all these in-person events and things scheduled with our community partners, but that all stopped. We immediately went on Zoom. In March 2020, we were on Zoom with our community partners, getting everyone on Zoom. And then we were figuring out what the needs were. These were some of the hardest hit communities in the world for COVID. They were starting to count cases before the government noticed that these communities were suffering. We started a dashboard together, crowdsourced data from different favelas. The dashboard became a huge rallying tool to show that communities were being affected and harmed. We started doing live events online, debates with community leaders on the panels. The same stuff CatCom's always done, except we did it all online. So it became really visible. And this was only possible because we had the flexibility. Literally dropped. The Sustainable Favela Festival was supposed to start in 2020. We started it only in 2024. We adapted quickly. We were responding to need. And all of a sudden funders were like, wow, look at them. Look what they're doing. And it became visible what we had always been doing. But we weren't always marketing ourselves because we were in the weeds working on community issues. And we didn't want to risk the trust we had with community partners. And if we spent a lot of time running after funders and creeping our mission to meet their demands and their theories of change, we're not going to be able to do the work we do. So it was always this balancing act. All of a sudden, we had 5 major grantors. Our resources jumped. We were able to do incredible work with that money. And then last year, interestingly, at the same time, 4 of those 5 all of a sudden switched their focus or their program officer or whatever and informed us that they were no longer going to continue. And so, all of a sudden, here we are again. Ultimately, the backbone of CATCOM continues to be these individual supporters. It's different to foundation funding. I think we should learn a lot from it.
So I think in terms of what stands out to you as great practices from funders, the things you talked about is the fact that once there's a track record, you don't need to keep trying to get those organizations to prove themselves again and again and again. They already have a track record. They've existed a long time. We should be supporting them and enabling them to keep moving forward. And that's one. The second thing you mentioned is the critical need for nonprofits like yours to be flexibly responsive, especially in complex community scenarios where the environment is complex and changing. And of course, the other thing you talked about is that people always are looking to give you grants to spread to other cities and other places when actually there's a time and place for some organizations to stay local because that issue is a specialized local problem, but it's also still at a massive scale that requires dedicated focus. And finally, going back to this longer term funding, I wondered if you had any good examples of any of those.
So we've had, I would say, 2 cases. In the early days, a small family foundation gave us a matching grant, which was absolutely critical to our starting. And it was no strings attached. It was a family foundation who recognized that there was some potential, but also some risk, but was willing to see how it went and support. But also, it was a one-time match. It propelled me and gave me the opportunity to run after other funding with a match in my hand. And that's actually how we started our individual donor network. I was able to take this match to a large number of people. In a year, we went from maybe 12 funders to 70 as I found people that were helping us meet that match, and then we expanded from there. So matching grants are actually a brilliant thing, especially early on, because it allows you to then create a network and develop skills. It gives you something to really latch on to as you fundraise, but also in critical moments where you need to galvanize groups of people, they can really help. And then more recently, we had a foundation that supported us that felt like an amazing fit. They developed a real relationship with us. They visited us on site. We participated in an international exchange with other grantees that was beautifully designed and allowed us to really build relationships with them. They were flexible. The other thing they did was they had a reporting model where we didn't actually have to report actively. They had someone accompanying our newsletter and our social media and our work. So they actually had somebody on staff whose job was to keep track of what the grantees are doing. And it was absolutely brilliant.
It's interesting. I've not come across that before.
Yeah, exactly. I think they're trying to innovate and they're doing a good job. Obviously, they required an initial grant proposal, which we designed together, but it was for us to do the things that we need to do. It wasn't their theory of change of what needs to happen. What they did, and I think this is a recipe in general, they identify what their core issues are. So where is their niche? And then they actually initially searched globally themselves for organizations that were doing that kind of work well, rather than opening to a call for proposals. My experience of calls for proposals is that often whoever's the person behind the scenes, they have some idea already of what they want. And they may even already know who they want to fund. And essentially, the process is about showing numbers of how many people apply to them and how popular they are and making it competitive. But ultimately, it's fairly predetermined at some level who they're going to support. And it's often the people they already have relationships with. I really haven't seen many situations where funding came in without any previous contact. The organization applied and received funding without some sort of relationship or previous knowledge on the part of the funder of that organization. So over the years, essentially, I've become very skeptical about applying for grants unless there's an invitation from the foundation or I have met someone from there or I've seen what they fund is very similar to us on the ground, and I know that we're part of that ecosystem, then I'll reach out to them personally to see if we should apply rather than put organizational resources of our small organization towards that work. So going back, I think in general, we can learn a lot for the foundation world from individual philanthropy. For example, it supports the work you've done. You're reporting on what you've done. We've done this. Support us to do more. You're giving a sense of where you're going with that, but then the individual is donating, and what you're doing can actually shift if it needs to shift. And then the next year, you're reporting on what we've done, and if they like it, they keep going. And so there's the ability for the flexibility to happen. You're supporting the track record of the organization rather than what they're projecting into the future. Another thing is how you communicate with your individual donors is material that you can use as a nonprofit for many things. That newsletter is going to go out with partners, to funders, to the public. It becomes material for social media. It becomes material for newspapers or for citations. When you write a report to a grant maker, it's going to be read by a half dozen people at most. It's going to be responding just to their questions. And you probably can't use that in very many other contexts. So the nonprofit has spent a lot of time producing material that isn't going to be useful to it elsewhere. And there are other things as well. I think studying how individual philanthropy works can actually be a model for how foundations should behave as well. So we've talked about the track record. We've talked about the grant cycles being longer and having more of a projection. We've talked about this idea of reporting being simpler, the grant maker accompanying the organization's natural public reporting. If grant makers could keep their models trying to create some sort of standard so that organizations can respond maybe in a collective forum, like, university applicants in some countries, they fill out the same questions on a website and all the universities see the same response, something like that. Matching grants, again. And I think close, honest relationships with the program officers, that they should know the reality on the ground as much as possible.
Any good example you can share of a close relationship that really stood out for you and really helped you?
Yeah, we had a great relationship with ICS, the Brazilian Institute for Climate and Society, where their program officer would attend some of our bigger milestones. So when we had 20 community leaders and a number of allies go to Brasilia, capital of Brazil, to advocate for energy justice, we were way out of our comfort zone. Almost nobody in the group had been to, advocate with federal officials. So we had to design this week of influence based on a report that was incredibly powerful, where community leaders in 15 favelas had interviewed 1,200 residents and had this detailed study that no government or university would have been able to get because people wouldn't talk openly to them. But the way we were able to design that is that the program officer connected us to their grantees in Brasilia that work to advocate for energy at the federal level. And we were able to develop through those partners a strategy that allowed us to take these community voices on the ground to these federal officials. And we were only able to do that because we had the combined knowledge of all of these, NGO leaders in Brasilia who formed this partnership. So the program officer essentially made that possible and really built, impact from that. So I would say that's a really good example of a good relationship.
I think my main takeaway from that is that there's a lot that foundations and institutional funders can learn from individual philanthropists. And if they can do it, why can't foundations do things the same way? On that note, let's move on to the second part of this conversation, which is which practices have you found to be most crippling or damaging, least helpful in your career so far? We mentioned some already, especially the ones about restricted funding and expectations that forced you to stay small and look for smaller, more flexible funding because of the type of work that you're doing. What else have you seen in your career so far?
Before I mention those, I just wanted to do a conclusion from the previous section about the relationships with program officers.
Yeah.
I think all of those non-grant relationships can continue post-grant. That's something else that I think would be a good practice. If they create a community of grantees, that can remain. If they support connecting among grantees in ways that are empowering, that can remain. Facilitating access to spaces to speak publicly or connections to other funders. We've had that as well. as a grant ends. So those are all things that I think can continue, understanding that we're part of an ecosystem and money is only one resource.
Has anyone done that in your experience for you so far?
I've seen the intention to do that. In practice, I've not. I've heard funders say they're going to do that. They plan to do that. They think they're doing that. But in practice, not really.
So that's
No.
clearly a gap, isn't there? That does segue back into these less helpful practices and then leading into the really unhelpful ones. So what would you say have been the most painful funding experiences that you've had in your time so far?
Okay. The most painful is when they create expectations and then they back out. That has cost us tremendously because we're a small organization. And because of our nature, I often am deeply involved in the fundraising, but also in supporting the programming. And so the time that I take, for example, it's sort of critical to where the organization goes. It would be great if we had more people, but we don't have the resources for that. So essentially, you're taking time away from something else. I've had a couple of situations where I or other people in the organization, we've spent months developing a grant, say with a funder who implied that if we worked really close to them, multiple meetings, discussions, developing a program, then we would have very solid support for a period of time. One of those happened, and we're now in this third cycle with them. But two other times we have had that kind of process where something changed. In one case, they just changed their priorities as a funder, 2/3 of the way through this process. And another, there was a fellowship that involved resources that would be multi-year. And we went through the entire process and it got to the final round of interviews. And then they insisted that we needed to want to scale this work. And at the time, this was 2006, I guess. At the time I said, well, we scale through example. Our work is very locally rooted, but we are constantly in dialogue with other groups. We want to create an ecosystem of change. We don't want to be the protagonists of it all. That's not our intention. We can't get this level of understanding of other contexts and cities, but we want to work with other partners in those places who want to implement similar things, and then we can learn from each other. And that's going to be a more sustainable way to scale. But they didn't think that way, and so we didn't go on. And interestingly enough, a few years later, I was told by a former intern of ours who went to work in this organization that they were now talking about scaling by example. So I thought that was really interesting.
So there's two interesting points in that. One is this particular example where you finish the whole process and then you get rejected because you're not scaling in the way that they expect you to be scaling. But the reality is they could have known this before you entered the process, right up front. And this is something that other guests have brought up, which is it's so frustrating to be rejected or finally excluded from the grant process at the end for something that could quite easily have been established right up front before taking you to that process. But the second is there's often this mismatch in understanding and expectation or misalignment around what scale even means between funders and nonprofits. That's also part of these unhelpful practices where funders have a particular idea of what constitutes scale, which is typically a linear jump in reach, size, or growth. Whereas there are many other non-linear ways to scale, both in terms of the time frame of that scaling and in terms of the nature and path of that scaling. So these both constitute two different aspects of unhelpful practices that come through. And certainly, like you said, when people change their priorities, I don't know which is worse, in the middle of a grant or towards the end of a grant application process. Both are pretty painful.
Yeah, exactly. I think ethically, grant makers that request a lot of work from potential grantees in order to realize the grant, if they don't approve it in the end, there should be some sort of compensation. I don't know what that form would be, but it could be some level of funding just to compensate the time or a connection to another grantor or something, because that delayed our work. I mean, that was a year that I had actually spent, and I was literally going into the office of the grant maker on a monthly basis. It was time I would have spent doing events, fundraising, public speaking at universities and things like that. And I think there is an issue with the way money runs the show. right? I don't know if you might call something like a foundation and nonprofit industrial complex or something like that. It's essentially a bubble where nonprofits have to meet the needs of funders rather than the other way around. And ironically, this is the logic that we're trying to break. It's a nonprofit, right? Profit maximization doesn't work. And we're trying to break that logic that that's the way things have to work. And yet money decides, money is power. So I think the whole point of the sector is to realize this alternate that other worlds are possible and explore and experiment on these other worlds. But if you build the whole system in a way where money is deciding and the funders are deciding, you're keeping the same logic. And so I think we need to really take a second look at who's making the decisions. In CatCom's case, our community partners decide. Everything we do, they decide. They already have power and potential. It's just not realized fully. So we're there to help that happen. We've inverted that logic within Catalytic Communities. Community leaders and organizers are the people who help us design our programs, but also this thinking strategically about the context we're in as a society, the systemic issues we face where it might be make more sense to put our energy. And when we're doing that kind of work and a funder comes with their theory of change model that they've developed in an office somewhere, no offense, but they need to understand that we're actually on the ground seeing reality and addressing and trying to make those changes within the context of the reality that's being lived.
So you have one of two different things going on here, which is where funders aren't clear about really what they're trying to achieve, or often when they have an idea of what they want to achieve, it's made in an office somewhere and not really representative or reflective of the lived reality of that issue or that problem. Something that other guests have brought up is that gap in funders hiring or incorporating practitioners from the sectors that they are trying to fund as key decision makers. And that's, I guess, one of the big causal agents in this mismatch, this gap between what funders will then top down bring in versus what nonprofits and executors really see and experience on ground. Is that something you recognize in your experience with funders too?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of them do have awareness at some level, they're closer in. But even so, if you're not close to the issue, especially the more complex issues, you simply don't know enough to develop a theory of change yourself. And you really need to allow the organization to do its work if they have a track record.
Again, let's talk about paradigms, right? Why isn't there an expectation that those funders, if they're funding informal communities, why isn't their internal decision team made up of people like yourself, part-time in that organization, or simply being hired as leaders? Not like every single practitioner or ex-practitioner spends their whole life running nonprofits. Many leaders will establish nonprofits, and at a certain point, they will then hand off to professional teams. And sometimes CEOs of those organizations also move on. So there's certainly enough experienced people in the system that have dealt with those things on ground that you have the finances to pay for. So one of the interesting questions here is, are the choices to get out of the way of the nonprofit or to come up with it yourself? There's a third choice. Just relook at who you hire in your teams against the issues that you want to support.
Absolutely. I agree that can be a game changer. At the same time, I have seen where foundations did hire people who appear to be, I've seen two cases of this, where part of the change that happened where a grant was cut was they hired somebody that was from the field, but that person came in with their grantees in mind already. So that can happen because if you come from the field, you may already have your network that you think is doing the work that needs to be supported. So that's just the flip side of that. Even though I agree with you 100%, I think it needs to go further.
What would you say are the things that have hurt you the most? Because crippling practices have such a devastating impact on morale, on mental health, on stress, on team working. We've known each other for a while, and I know there have been ups and downs in that journey.
Well, one that broke me when I was young and starting led to our individual philanthropy approach, actually, was a foundation that was our first successful application in the sense of getting to be a finalist. So of something like 80 applicants, they whittled it down to 8, and we were one of those 8. And then we were told that the announcement would come soon about the final 3 that would receive the grant. A lot was riding on this. I had already been fundraising for nearly 2 years, or attempting grants, I should say, with no luck. And this was very exciting and hopeful. And what happened was I received an email inviting me to the awards ceremony for the grant recipient around the date I was told we would receive our response. So naturally, I thought, well, amazing. They're going to announce it at the award ceremony, and it's kind of like an Oscar kind of thing. You're going to announce, I don't know, but they're not going to invite you if you're not going to get the grant. It didn't occur to me that that would happen. So I got very excited. And then I called our board president and told him, and he stopped me and he said, "Did they actually tell you you were getting it?" And I'm like, "No." He said, I don't know. I wouldn't read it that way. And I was like, "No." And that's exactly what ended up happening. We weren't one of the three. But yeah, that was a terrible one. Actually, it was a couple of weeks before that I had had this experience with the family foundation that provided the match. And so I had hoped that this grant would be towards the match. And when this grant didn't come through, I only had a year to meet the match, which was going to be $50,000, which would have been $100,000 with the match, enough for over a year for us back then. So I went ahead and ran after the individual philanthropy. That whole situation pushed me and said, "Oh, I've got to raise $50,000 in the next year. This didn't come through. This foundation thing isn't working out." And an advisor and a friend who ran the Center for Teaching Peace in Washington, D.C., Coleman McCarthy, had a wonderful newsletter that he produced for his nonprofit. And he showed me the newsletter and he said, "You know what you do? You just put this together, pop it in the mail, and the checks come in." I said, "You know what? I'm going to do a newsletter." I did a newsletter. I printed 500 copies. I went door to door so I would save on stamps in the mailboxes of every house in the neighborhood that I had grown up in. I'm originally Brazilian on my mom's side and British on my dad's, but I was raised in Washington, D.C. So I did this in D.C. area. And 11 checks came back from the 500. And they were the 11 people I knew. And then I started sowing the seeds from there.
You have a great way of finding that silver line and being able to look at it from that lens, especially with the distance of hindsight and the fact that, 25 years on, you're still going strong. But, inside this story lies a great example of such a devastating level of disillusionment that that young version of Theresa just looked at that whole sector of foundation funding and thought, I can't, this is just unworkable. I'm going to have to find another path altogether. And I think that's the telling thing here, which is these kind of practices can leave an indelible mark on people and organizations. And yes, they can find ways to succeed and thrive despite it. We're built to adapt and find ways to get things done. But there shouldn't have been like that. You should have had that journey where you could have utilized all the various different types of funding. These kind of things can have such a powerful effect on how people and teams proceed, and not just personally, sometimes even programmatically.
Yeah, I agree. We live in a system, a culture, et cetera, that the assumption is if you have money, you know more, you're smarter, et cetera, et cetera. And that's not true, period. And grant makers should have a lot more humility and should be listening to and close to the people on the ground of the issues they care about. It's what we do at CatCom in a different way. We don't know. I don't live in a favela. I can't claim to speak for favelas ever, but I want to support favelas. So what do? I go and I get as close as I can to community leaders. I develop relationships with them. I show them over time they can trust me. I constantly listen to see what their needs are, and I figure out how can we strategically support those needs in ways that will really support their hard work. They are the ones in the trenches. They're the ones living the struggle day to day. They're the ones who make this their calling 24/7. So how do I, at the level, the scale that I'm at, add value to that with the resources that I have? Because I can't be that person in the trenches in the same way. That's not where I'm from, where I have a sense of belonging that I want to preserve and grow and improve. But I want to help them do that. So I think foundations could be modeled that way. What's the issue you care about? Find out who the people are who really live that issue and see how you can be strategically supportive to those people and maintain trust. And in the maintain trust part, you're going to have to find more humane ways to handle funding and then also see resources in a more broad sense. It's not just money, it's relationships, it's contacts, it's knowledge, it's networks, it's
Which
visibility.
is kind of taking us into the next part of this conversation. But before we do that, are there any other unhelpful practices that you really want to flag up?
We've covered it.
Yeah, I think in various ways, I think the biggest one that stands out here is around that sudden internal change in focus or programmatic officers that then reneges on commitments or just changes the landscape of those commitments. And this can have such a huge and devastating effect, especially on smaller organizations where they don't have huge amounts of resources chasing down 10, 12, 15 parallel funders for the same grant, which actually almost no nonprofits ever do. And I think is one of the things that a lot of funders are taking for granted, that we are just one of a number of people that they are raising money from. And it's really their problem if they can or can't raise that money. And they should be able to juggle the 10-to-1 hit and miss ratio without really appreciating the fact that these organizations don't have that level of resource. And typically, there's a mutual exclusivity between the time being spent on fundraising and the time that should be spent or could be spent on other more valuable, impactful things. When you are fundraising, as especially small, mid-sized organizations, you really have invested in that relationship. You've got that one, you're hopeful for it, that's where all your effort goes. You're not doing the same for 3 or 4 different funders at the same time for the same grant. We don't have that kind of emotional availability sometimes. So you almost are waiting to see that through, especially once you feel genuinely hopeful or confident in its result. And that can also then massively derail you time-wise, right? Because the alternative is, let's say you had 4 running and all 4 of them said yes for the same grant, you can't accept those 4. So there's a practicality component there too, which limits how many people you can keep juggling in the air for the same activities. And I feel like these are things that funders can't appreciate because they're never in that position. You already have your budget, your salary is already fixed. You're not juggling any of this financial input on a rolling basis. So yeah, to me, that's really the one that really stood out in terms of unhelpful practices.
So community leaders in favelas, they're very
Right.
skeptical of NGOs, governments, universities. One thing that can happen, for example, NGOs that get a grant, spend a year in a favela doing something, and they create something there that's really valuable, and then all of a sudden the grant goes and they leave. Community-based groups talk to us about how that harms the community and will often refer to themselves as, quote, scalded cats. The NGO is telling their funder how successful the project was. The community is saying how they were left without that service that people had grown to depend on. So community-based organizations who are long-term, they're committed because these are people who live there. They're people who care. They will work for free if they have to, but they should be supported. Our organization set up to support those folks, but developing trust from these people is hard. And maintaining it is also a hard work. The work we do requires that we don't spend tons of time fundraising and that we don't have multiple people grant writing, because that would look from the perspective of our community partners like we were exploiting them, and we would therefore not exist. So it creates a catch-22 as well for us, where we really do rely fully on funders, whether individual or foundation, that understand our need for flexibility. From our perspective, like I've said, our backbone, our core is our individual funders, which started out 12 or something like that. It's grown over the years to over 700 people. Those are the people who really guarantee the organization. And the flexibility we're talking about. The grants essentially allow us to have appendages.
Yeah.
And the bigger the grant, the more we can do beyond our core. But the core activities are the most important in terms of maintaining the relationships, the trust, and building slowly over time towards ultimately systemic change, which needs us to stay committed. It needs us to stick around. It needs us to be there. It needs community leaders to see that we're still there after all these years. So it's the nature of the organization, the work we do. It also makes it harder to have that, multi-grant writing machine that maybe a different organization might have, or a different organization that might model it more on the private sector that's trying to build in, quote, redundancy, where you have, extra people on the team to do things. it's not as realistic for the nonprofit sector, and it's not at all possible in an organization like ours.
Actually, talking about an organization like yours, when we move on to your vision of a future of funding that is more impactful and more effective, there was a point that you made earlier about potentially mirroring the way CATCOM supports its partners. So I'd love to get your ideas on what a powerful new paradigm of funding could be. I wonder if what you're doing could be a model.
Okay. All right. Well, I would say the recipe would start with, first of all, know what issues are important to you as the funder. So start with your own passions. I think that it's important that people have a commitment to something that comes from an inner purpose, more intrinsic, right? And then from there, I would say spend some time digging in the weeds. If we're following what CATCOM did is the beginning, I spent a year going to community meetings and hearing what community leaders were going through. The equivalent would be spending a year close to nonprofits that are in that field that you are interested in supporting and spending some time actually listening to what they're going through.
Like a sectoral due diligence, not just due diligence on the organizations to see if they're the right fit for you, but now you're looking at the sector as a whole, the issue or that geography, and who is operating in there, what the solutions are, what the gaps are. And I feel like this is a very important piece that isn't always done by funders in the way that it should be. Yeah, it's a good point.
And then as they're spending time with these organizations, design their programs, their funding, and other resource programs. Again, I think it's really interesting to broaden the concept of resources here. I think that could be a really interesting strategy too. But understand that it's about broad support for this sector. So it wouldn't necessarily be just money. So that all of the organizations you're visiting can actually be part of this umbrella ultimately. So you're not creating a competitive environment. No, we're all working in this together. And then we're going to figure out how resources might work, how we might be able to channel resources towards this field, this sector.
So you're talking about sectoral enablers, not just funding nonprofits directly, but funding things that allow all organizations in that sector to be able to operate better or to be more impactful, the things that everybody can lean on. Is that what you mean?
I'm imagining beyond nonprofits even. It could be individuals, groups, social movements that might not be formalized, but sort of who's in this field? What's happening in this field? And how do we support this field so that change happens at scale with all of these different actors that care about this issue? And before you even think about what resources are involved, money or otherwise, you're understanding this field that you're interested in. And then respecting that visceral connection that people on the ground have, where they are really the experts and you're learning from them. Of course, there's other types of systematized academic knowledge that you can bring in and other types of expertise. And those could be among the resources that you support them with. They don't need to come from people in the field. The people in the field may be producing those kinds of knowledge, but they may be producing other kinds of knowledge, indigenous knowledge, traditional ancestral knowledge, or other types of knowledge that we won't have access to. So how do we support them and the people who have a sense of belonging to that issue? Again, they're doing that work regardless of the money already.
Yeah.
These are people, they're just passionate. If they put their time into something else, they probably would make more money, but they're putting their time into this. And then try to understand as much as possible who's already on the ground, who's flexibly, dedicatedly, without resources, responding to that issue. And also at different scales. So small scale to large scale, and not think one scale is better or more important than the other. Because again, it's an ecosystemic approach. So you're seeing this as an ecosystem, different levels and scales and niches and so on. And if you see it that way, then you create a non-competitive environment. You're actually trying to create a cooperative environment within that field that you care about. And then from there, naturally, you will learn what the issues are, what the approaches are, what the hurdles are, what the barriers are, where there are conflicts within that sector that might be able to be addressed through approaches that bring people together and build awareness so that you're actually building the world that you're trying to build as you're doing this. So it's not just you're paying someone to go do a piece of the pie, a piece of the puzzle. You're actually putting the puzzle together and making sure that it's cohesive. So then based on the funds that you have, which are probably tiny, minuscule compared to the scale See, the problem is they go the other way around. They're like, we have this money. How do we make impact with it? But look at all these other resources we have. We have these academics working on this in their universities, and we have community knowledge over here. So the resource pool is actually much larger than money. But the thing is, again, this whole universe has been created by people with money. You think money can buy everything. And the truth is it
Absolutely.
can't. And if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I don't know if you've ever looked at it through this lens. We built a system where the only things you can buy with money are the basic needs. It's food, shelter, health care, et cetera, et cetera. And all of the things at the top, community, family, meaning, et cetera, no money will ever buy those things. And so we've built a system where to tap into basic needs, you need money. But actually, most things that we need to be happy in society cannot be monetized. So recognizing a different approach to resources, I think would be amazing because the ecosystem exists. They're working for the health and well-being of that ecosystem, which includes its diversity, which includes that people are in their niches and can be supported in their niches instead of needing to creep out of their mission into another niche that maybe isn't really best because that's where the money pot is. I think that's how I would do it. And then with the money resources, think about how to apply those in ways that are also supporting the organizations in those ecosystems, developing other resources. So there's a fundraising author called Lynn Twist. She talks about money as something very much kind of around the environment and needing to flow, and that a fundraiser's job is not to take a piece of the pie, it's to grow the pie. It's essentially to give people opportunities to support causes they care about. And so instead of thinking about resources in this limited way, how do we expand the resources that are available? How do we get more people on board to make the changes society needs to make? Get everyone who can be an ally in that field together and map out all of the types of resources that are available, and don't leave any resources behind. Don't say, oh, because you're small scale or because you're community based, you're less important, because that's just not true. If every single human on the planet made a few decisions collectively oriented, we'd be in a very different planet right now. Small scale is ultimately where things need to go for change to happen. People don't change because of top-down mandates. They change from inside. So I think valuing organizations that are working at that scale and that are working at community level is a huge thing that needs to happen as well.
I can definitely see the parallels with how you've approached your work with Catalytic Communities, because in the end, you're not from the favelas yourself, right? It's not your personal lived experience. So you're coming in as an external party that is supporting the actors within those favelas to be able to take action for themselves. And in an interesting way, it is a mirror version of what a funder is doing for nonprofits. You may not necessarily be here acting as a grant conduit, but in essence, you are playing that same kind of role, which says that there are already activists and there are already organizations, there are already individuals and actors within these communities that are working hard to help themselves and to help each other. And then CatCom is playing that role of supporting all of them to be able to achieve that to best effect. This in its own way represents a particular model or paradigm of how funding could also be successful by approaching these issues from that same lens. You brought up a very important point, which is even if you have a $10 million fund, it is still a drop in the ocean amount of money relative to the amount of support, financing, etc. required for the scale of these systemic issues. So relatively, doesn't matter how big you are as a funder, you're still a small piece. So there's a parallel there, which may not seem obvious at first, but the reality is that within the overall pool of how much money is and resources required, whatever an individual organization is able to provide is just a drop in that ocean. But still, with just that drop, you've been able to achieve so much. So I feel that there's potentially an interesting parallel that maybe you could muse on for a few minutes.
Yeah, I love it. My undergrad was in biology, ecology, environmental studies, and also some anthropology. And then I went into urban planning. So for me, I think in terms of ecosystems. And like any ecosystem, the more diverse, it's more resilient. And so hearing you reflect back on what I said, I was thinking about if we had a layered approach, a nested and layered approach, where you have organizations and groups working. So community leaders in favelas are essentially there to support community residents. And then organizations like ours are at the next scale up. So we're looking at community leaders. We're working with community organizers. How do we support them to do that work on the ground, which is often very hard work with very little recognition? The layer that we're working on is that layer of community organizers across a city, right? And supporting them, working with each other, building knowledge and networks across each other, sharing resources, 90 something percent of which is non-financial. Very little money is involved in catalyzing this exchange of knowledge across neighborhoods. And so how do we use the money we have in strategic ways that are going to support these important things at that level? And then you could get the next level up, right? We have regional organizations, but it could also be by sector. It could be across housing or across human rights or immigrant communities and so on. There are organizations that are working across the diaspora. So this sort of multi-level, multi-topic network, you could create a whole ecosystem around this. And funders would be one of these, but understanding that part of the problem is that the money creates a power dynamic and it creates a sense of hierarchy over other types of knowledge and resources. And we're never going to win the battle if we're keeping that logic at the center. So money is a tool. It was invented as a tool. It was a means, not an end. And I think it's really important that we identify as part of that toolbox that we have as civil society. But it's no more important or less important than other tools, some of which you cannot purchase because it's community, it's trust.
There's two interesting takeaways that we can pull out that I think could form the kernel of different funding model, which is one, this concept of layered support, right? Understanding that it's a layered system and how do you support across those layers? And then the other bit that comes out is rethinking the value and the proportion of other types of support beyond money, or reevaluating your potential to facilitate, create, and enable those things as a funder beyond the money that you're able to provide. And I wonder whether we could call it an asset-based funding model or maybe call it a layered funding model. There'd be an interesting concept there that is worth thinking about and exploring as a funder. Instead of just limiting yourself to one scale of nonprofit, consider how you can engage with that system across all its scales. And some of that is not necessarily directly through money, but through other types of support and resources. So that's really what stands out to me, and I find that super interesting. Is there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, that example I cited earlier about the funder who connected us to partners in Brasilia that allowed us to have this exponential impact in a short period of time. It was a really big deal. And the organizations in Brasilia benefited so much from having the community perspectives that brought voice to the issues that they work on. So everybody benefited. This is the biggest competitive advantage of the third sector, the nonprofit sector, is that we can be in collaboration. We can partner. We're not competing. We shouldn't compete because that makes us ineffective, inefficient. It harms us. It shoots us in the feet. It's terrible. We need to see ourselves as part of the same goal with different means, different approaches, which is good because you want that diversity like any ecosystem. You want the different approaches. Money would have made it prohibitive or taken years. The context the funder provided took months and was beneficial to all and probably saved money to all. The other thing I just wanted to add is I think we need to move away from the term funds because it is one type of resource. So I think having a more holistic approach will require new language.
Just switching from thinking of yourself as a funder to a resourcer might also be an interesting paradigm shift, isn't it? Where you think about how you resource that sector rather than fund that sector. And then fund is one aspect of resourcing that sector. And then that opens up a whole world of other sectoral considerations, from people to skills to knowledge to networks to cooperatives to functional policy. There's a bunch of backbone technologies or infrastructures that glue that sector together. Sometimes even things like having a decent online fundraising platform that everybody can use, for example, allows that sector to resource itself. So in a way, you're resourcing that sector with a capability that individual organizations can't meaningfully produce.
Excellent.
So I think that's a brilliant way for us to close out today's conversation. Thank you so much for all your thoughts. This was super illuminating.
Yeah, it's been really fun. Thank you.